This week, we're digging more deeply into imposter syndrome.
You are listening to Love Your Job Before You Leave It, the podcast for ambitious, high-achieving women who are ready to stop feeling stressed about work and kiss burnout goodbye forever. Whether you're starting a business or staying in your day job, this show will give you the coaching and guidance you need to start loving your work today. Here's your host, career coach Corey Lynn.
Hey, y'all. I read a book a while back that I meant to tell you about, even though it has nothing to do with work, and it's just a delightful little romance novel. But I always like to just pepper in my reading recommendations into the podcast because I think it's super fun. And I think it's a good reminder that part of having an amazing career is doing stuff that has nothing to do with your amazing career. Unless you're a writer, and then this might have something to do with it. Either way, a friend of mine recommended this romance novel to me, and I read it, tore through it really fast. It's a fun book. It's called Satisfaction Guaranteed. It's a queer romance novel. So if that sounds like something that's fun to you, I highly suggest you grab yourself a copy and enjoy. It's a delight to read. I am so grateful for fun novels and things to read because they really add so much delight to my life. And I just love getting to know the characters. And it's also just a really interesting way for me to engage with like how other people do things, even though in this case, the other people are fictional characters. Usually it's really interesting to get to know them and to get to know their mindsets, or especially for me as a coach, I'm like, ooh, what are they doing? Why are they doing that? Look at this thing that's driving their behavior. It's so fascinating. So anyways, if you're into that, check that out. And now that I've given you my informal book review, let us get to our main topic, which is imposter syndrome. Again, yay, we're going to talk about it again. So I was coaching a client of mine recently, and we were talking about imposter syndrome. And I was like, why don't we just call it what it is? Like, stop calling it imposter syndrome and call it internalized oppression. And I feel like that's a big phrase to like throw around, like, oh, oppression. But in the other podcast where we talked about imposter syndrome, I talked about the thought processes, like the thought patterns rather, that I think are pretty central to this concept of imposter syndrome. But we didn't talk about how you get those thought patterns. But we do often on this podcast talk about where thought patterns come from. So you probably already know, but let's review. They usually come from culture at large, our family of origin, authority figures from when we were younger, peers, and also things like books and movies, TV shows, all that kind of stuff. So if you have imposter syndrome thoughts, you didn't just make those up. You didn't just decide one day to think, you're not good enough, you don't belong, or I'm not good enough, I don't belong, if you think in first person. I actually often think in second person, as I've discussed before. And I actually wanted to mention, I think that's because a lot of the stuff we're thinking is stuff that someone else literally said to us. Right? So there is some of that implicit, like where we absorb things, but I think a lot of our thought patterns are things literally other people said out of their face holes to us, and then our brain started repeating. So I do see a lot of that second person, which is the you. For those of y'all who are like, what the fuck is she talking about with the grammar? Second person is you, first person is I or me. Okay. Anyways, so I wanted to do another podcast episode to talk about this because, like I said, I was coaching my client and I've been thinking a lot about it. And then I went back and listened to my podcast episode on imposter syndrome. And I was like, oh yeah, there's so much information missing that I think is really important for people to get a deeper understanding of this and to also be able to turn it around and to change those thought patterns. Because if we're like, oh, I have the thought I'm not good enough because I'm not, then of course we're probably not going to want to change that thought pattern. But if we are like, oh, I have the thought I'm not good enough because I grew up in, a sexist, ableist, white supremacist culture that informed me that I was not good enough, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, and then I absorbed that idea, then we're like, oh, for sure I'm going to fucking floss that like back out of my brain because that's not my idea about myself based on evidence or any things I've done or my capacities, capabilities. It's messaging that I absorbed from other people who probably didn't have my best interest at heart. So why is this so important? Like I said before, one of the reasons it's so important to understand this is because you might not feel compelled to change those thought patterns if you think they're true or if you think they actually have something to do with you. Whereas you might feel more compelled to change them if you see that they're coming from somewhere else or they came from a society that you also think is flawed in the way that I do. And some of y'all might not, but that is the way I see it. And it's my podcast. So that's what we're talking about here. Okay. I also want to alert you to an article that you may or may not have seen. It's called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. And it's by, I'm going to do my best with pronunciation, Ruchika Tolshian and Jodi Ann Burry are how I'm guessing we pronounce these names. And it's in the Harvard Business Review. And I read it a while back and I've been like thinking about it sort of and metabolizing it ever since it came out earlier this year, but after I had done my first podcast. So one of the first points they make in this article that I think is incredibly powerful is that by calling this imposter syndrome, like naming things is powerful and it's important and can help us get help. But one thing it can also do is it pathologizes this thing that's actually very normal, which is just doubting our abilities and wondering if we fit in. A lot of people doubt their abilities. A lot of people wonder if they fit in. Those are very normal things to have happen. And when we package those up as a syndrome, it can make it seem like something is wrong with you if you have those thought patterns. And that's really reductive view. It also makes it about you, the person experiencing the thought patterns versus like, where the fuck did these thought patterns come from? You didn't make them all up. Like I was saying, you absorbed them from culture. And in a culture that is still full of patriarchy, you're probably still being offered these thought patterns all the time. Even if you intellectually as an adult don't agree with those thought patterns, they could still be playing out subconsciously for you, especially if you learned them from when you were a child and they seem like just the rules of how things in our culture go. Another thing this article talks about that I thought was really interesting is that when they were studying imposter syndrome, they really only studied a very specific group of people, and they did not look into other things that probably were having an impact, right? So they looked at this group of high achieving women, and the idea was that these women had all these accomplishments, but they still had all this self-doubt and they didn't see themselves the way other people saw them, right? But that original study that looked at imposter syndrome didn't look at other impacts, like the impacts of how the people in the study were treated, right? Like how women are treated in the workplace and what's happening culturally that might be impacting those thought patterns that they're having. And they also didn't look at like the experiences of people of color or women of color or other groups that experience bias and marginalization. So what the article talks about is that by doing this, it really puts a lot of the emphasis on the person experiencing the doubt and the lack of belonging versus also looking at the bigger picture and what the culture is like and how people are treated and how that impacts how they think about themselves, their capacity to fit in, and their capacity to do good work. So all of this brings me back to what I was saying I said to that client. When the client said that she was experiencing imposter syndrome, and I said, let's call it what it is. Let's call it internalized oppression. Because here's the thing. In this article, they're talking about like, let's not blame women if they're experiencing imposter syndrome, which is let's not blame and pathologize women and people of marginalized identities if they're experiencing these thought patterns about worrying if they're good enough and worrying if they fit in and being uncertain of their capacity to do the job that they're trying to do. Let's not blame those women for that when there's all these other things at play, right? And in this article, they're talking about workplace culture. And I agree that that's a really important thing to work on. And they talk specifically about how, women and people with marginalized identities are excluded and unfairly critiqued or given vague feedback that doesn't actually like help them improve or do whatever it is they're trying to do in the workplace. And then those women begin to doubt themselves and they become disengaged and their career trajectory shifts and suffers because of that external experience where they're not being treated fairly and they're not being supported and things like that. And that's all very important. But what I want to point out, because my podcast is more about what you can do for yourself and what you can do for your office versus working at the level of the organizational culture as a whole. I want to point this out to you so that when you hear this self-doubt and you hear this questioning in your mind of like, do I belong? Do I fit in? Am I good enough? Am I okay? You can understand what that is and you can shift your thoughts internally. Now, obviously, shifting your thoughts internally isn't necessarily going to change the things happening in your workplace. You may be in a workplace where you're experiencing microaggressions or you're experiencing bias and you're basically being invited into imposter syndrome thoughts all the time. That's possible. But what I think is important to think about here, and this is how I think about it, is that thought work, the kind of work I do with coaching, teaching you how to think differently and to not just absorb the thoughts everyone around you offers, is I think about it like building an immune system of your thoughts. So when we're babies and little kids, we will just absorb what everyone around us teaches us. We don't question things a lot, or even if we do question them, they might still get absorbed into our subconscious as like, this is the way it is. These are the rules. Even if we bristle against them, there's like part of our brain that's like assessing, like, these are the rules of the game in this world I've been born into. And we'll absorb them, and then they will limit us in what we can create and do for ourselves. And when we know that that's happening, then we can see those thoughts, understand that they're not an inside job. You are not your thoughts. These are things you absorb from outside of you. They're just patterns. We can unlearn them and learn a new pattern. That gives you so much power back. And specifically with imposter syndrome, I think that is very important because, like I said, we do live in a world that's full of patriarchy and white supremacy and all these things that are going to really encourage you to think about yourself in ways that I think they're oppressive, right? When we absorb this enculturation, oppression becomes internal, not just external. We will police ourselves from inside our own heads based on the thoughts we have. And when we know thought work, we can see and question that, then we don't have to do that. Now, I want to be really clear. I do want culture to change. I want workplace cultures to change. I want to see big, broad changes in how we treat humans. And I would love to see us as a species overcoming and unlearning these biases. And I think it's really important we do that individually as part of that process. And it's not to take the responsibility away from other parties. I do think workplaces have responsibility in what kind of work culture they create for their people. And if you don't change the internalized thoughts, sometimes you'll stay in situations where, it's problematic for you because you believe it can't be any better, or you believe this is just the way it is, or you believe like, oh, I just have imposter syndrome. I'm always going to feel like this. So this is why I always want to encourage you to be doing this work on an individual level, because when you do it on an individual level, then you'll start to make changes in your life. And the changes you're making in your life will help you get to a better place. And they'll also give you the fuel you need that if you want to go change culture, you have energy available to do that. So I think this is a really important distinction because I really want y'all to understand that if I say that imposter syndrome comes down to the thoughts you have that you've absorbed from culture, that doesn't mean it's your fault. It doesn't mean everyone else who taught you those thoughts is off the hook. It doesn't mean it's okay that they did that. It just means, hey, at this point, the place that the imposter syndrome is doing the most damage is inside your head. We want to get it out of there. And once we get it out of there, then you'll be able to make different choices about what you're doing with your career, what kind of workplaces you want to work in, what kind of activism you want to do. And you'll be able to do that because basically it's like having a layer to protect you from that external oppression, right? So in our culture as it is today, people are going to be offering you unhelpful thoughts all the fucking time. They're going to be offering you the thought that you're not working enough. They're going to be offering you the thought that you should feel guilty for XYZ. They're going to be offering you the thought that you'll never fit in. Whatever. People are going to offer us unhelpful thoughts all fucking day long. It's not even because they're bad people. It's because they've absorbed all this socialization too. And thoughts are like viruses. They just want to spread. They will spread through people. They'll spread through people's mindsets and they'll try to basically go get in other people's brains. But when you understand how thoughts work and that you're going to be offered that socialization and that you can choose to think differently, like I said, then you have an immune system. You have something to protect you against all those thoughts out there that are inviting you to doubt yourself and inviting you to question yourself and inviting you to think that like, this is the only kind of life you can ever have. Okay. So let's review. Number one, if you have the thought patterns that I was talking about before, and I've talked about today that we're going to call imposter syndrome thought patterns, it's not because of you or what you've done or what you're capable of. It's because a lot of us are offered those thoughts or were offered those thoughts in our childhood a lot. And I want to be clear here that like some of this comes down to like how we're socialized as women or girls. Some of it comes down to other socialization if we belong to like a marginalized identity. Some of it comes down to individual socialization if we experienced someone in our childhood telling us we're not good enough and we should doubt ourselves and we'll never fit in, then we're going to probably have those thought patterns now, even if you don't fit into any of the categories I've been mentioning here. There's lots of different ways we can absorb thoughts. And if you have them, you get to work on them, even if the groups you belong to mostly don't have them. That happens too. The other thing I want to talk about, and this article mentioned that I thought was so good, is like, I think it's also important to normalize that a lot of people have some self-doubt and a lot of people want to fit in and aren't sure if they will. And just because you have those thought patterns doesn't mean you have to like put this label of imposter syndrome on them. You could also call that being a human with a human brain. And what you may notice is when you call it being a human with a human brain, it feels different than when you call it imposter syndrome. Being uncertain sometimes isn't necessarily a problem. It is part of human life and part of living in a world that's full of uncertainty, y'all. And when we live in a culture that's full of biases, we're going to absorb that biased thinking into our brains. And then we're going to experience it not just from the outside world, but from ourselves also. And I personally think unlearning it internally first helps us create the changes we want to see in the larger world. And again, that doesn't mean it's okay that other people are doing that. It just means we have to pick somewhere to start. And, I think like as much as I would like the world to just be magically different, we have to start where we are. And changing your thoughts about yourself is a way to do that. And it's not just for you and it's not just for your benefit. Although if you only ever do it for you and your benefit, I think that's fine and you get to choose. But when we do it for ourselves, I think it also ripples out and makes bigger changes in the world. And then we go on to create better work cultures that are more inclusive and diverse and equitable for all kinds of people. And if you want a deeper dive on once you've identified the thoughts, like what they're from, and you want to just work on the thought piece, go listen to the other podcast on imposter syndrome because it's going to help you figure out how to do that. Okay, that's what I have for y'all today. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Love Your Job Before You Leave It. We'll have another episode for you next week. And in the meantime, if you're feeling super fired up, head on over to CoreyLynn.com for more guidance and resources.